First of all, thank you, ForgeRock, for bringing me out to my hometown. It's really, really nice. And I suppose the view out here as well, it just doesn't get old, does it? It's excellent. My name's Ian Sorbello, and I guess what I do is I look at next-gen security, and more to the point, how do I get it into a bank? How do I get into a really big bank? And I think that aspect around a big bank is particularly relevant for HSBC. It's quite huge. HSBC Global, in terms of all of its geography and markets that it works in. My team, or the department I work in, is HDS, HSBC Digital Solutions. So what we do is, in fact, full global technology. With all the markets, we look at a single methodology around what we think in terms of tech and architecture, and we see how do we roll that out across the world in order to create a one strategy. The main thing about a one strategy is that you may do it a certain way, but there are different needs that exist across the globe. So different markets have different views, and you actually have to build for that. In terms of the particular focus of this talk, it's about access management. More to the point, how do we do customer access management into the bank? And the view being around that is it's actually designed for variance. Security is usually fairly static. It's built into a system, and the way we're doing it is really to say, well, we're actually designing it for it to be different depending upon where it's running. We have a very, very strong appetite for biometry, so we are going to see some pretty radical changes in customer authentication process in the new year as we start to see the uptake of biometrics within certain markets. And also I'm going to talk about APIs. So HSBC is executing on an API strategy as we speak. Identity management I will touch on because it's also quite relevant to a really large bank such as ours. The identity silos are extraordinary within HSBC, and we really don't have a very good global view of you and me. And the sort of last part of that is around your organisation's developers. So as security technologists, I actually think we serve our developer community rather than just a customer experience. So that sort of goes into the whole point around the democracy and commoditisation, which is the subtext of this talk. It's about how do we create capabilities that are commodity. Security is a commodity that you effectively should just be able to turn on and use. And democracy being how can I, in a certain market or a particular place within an organisation, use that security and technology to the way I need it to, rather than a dictation from the top down. So HSBC is quite big, 37 markets, and we exist in 70 countries. And we deal with around about 37 million customers, and that's just in retail. It doesn't include private and institutional banking as well. The customer base, whilst big, is also, from an individual daily load perspective, isn't radical. So in any one market, it's not like HSBC has got huge, bigger load than, say, even one of the big fours here in Australia. But it's more about the diversity between the customer bases that exist within those markets. We're talking about different culture, different geopolitical aspects that come into play. That's where the complexity is within HSBC. It's the variance across the globe. And from an IT physical perspective, we run out of 3 major geographical points of presence. So we have North America, EU, and Asia Pacific. The view being, of course, one solution globally, so we roll out across to those points of presence. And when we roll out, the real question that I have is when we deploy to prod, it's kind of the question of what prod are we rolling out to? And I think this goes to one of the first big things that hit me when I started working with HSBC. The first planning sessions that I went into just blew my mind. I was like a rabbit in a spotlight when we were talking about the rollout of security, and everything became three-dimensional. And by that I mean that normally you think of a product and you do some build and you deploy and you run to a production footprint. But in HSBC, there's so many productions. So you're running in Mexico, United States runs off the same POP, the same technologies there. There's relationships between the versions that are running there. You're dropping into Hong Kong, which affects Australia, affects Philippines, and you just end up with this huge grid or cube of stuff. Where are we on the version deployment line? In what market? And so when you're looking at a technology base there, it's a very, very complicated problem to solve. And that sort of underpins pretty much what the actual approach was around the new next-gen security platform. The reality is that there was no way that I was going to solve it one way. I needed to solve it in a way where I created a set of capabilities that could drop to a point of presence, and different parts of those capabilities gets used by a market. I was never able to sort of say, I know how to do this one way. So the method to do that was to really look towards what is available. The question around OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, there were fairly obvious views around what's next in terms of security, the maturation of standards. I think banks certainly, to date, have built a lot of their own security. Definitely the banks I've worked for are no exception to that. But we're at a point now where you actually say, well, can banks continue to build all of their own stuff? I think you can, but I think you have to ask what it is you're going to build. If you look at the specs, you could probably build an OAuth 2 server. You could probably do OpenID Connect and implement the protocol. It's probably not that hard. The question is, do you want to? Because you're going to put an effort in. Protocols change, you evolve. Is that your core business? So what the view would be is that we have a desire to use the protocols, to use this new way of bringing different parts of the ecosystem together, but certainly not going to code it. And to my mind, I think when you install a product into a bank, you actually need to think about how you're coding that product for use. So it's how is that security as code? How is that infrastructure as code? But how is that as a developer's use of that security? That's the bit that you're actually spending your time on. So if you're building OIDC protocols in your stack, you're not spending time on how you're actually allowing your developer base to use it. And I think that's where the build part comes in. That's the bit you build. You certainly buy the commodity. In terms of changing the security layer within HSBC, it's a big place and there's lots of repositories there already. So the view is that you just put the middleware on top. We have lots of repositories that actually work quite well, but at the same time, the access management layer is something that you drop in and place into that space. Now, obviously, there's evergreening capabilities there. So when I think of LDAP, ForgeRock, OpenDJ, that is in fact, the greatest LDAP around. So we move to those kind of things independently, but by the same token, we utilize all of the identity repositories that exist and start to create the capability. Because it doesn't necessarily matter what's underneath as long as you've got the interconnect happening and getting started. It's no secret, of course, that we use ForgeRock to do that. So the ForgeRock world around, I think I'm using some old terminology here as well, with the access management and identity management installs, has been the technology of choice to bring that together. So that sort of reaches a point where we get to a security commoditized. It's a product that we put in, build it into our non-functional requirements and create the commodity there. The idea is to build that construction of capabilities that you can then use. The hardest part that I had to grapple with in terms of how we actually build this stuff has been the multiplicity. And by that I mean you put a product into a repository somewhere, or a point of presence. It has an access point. It's publicly available on the internet, so you can start hooking onto it. But the question then is, how do we actually break this stuff up? How many instances do we create? How many servers do I build? Do I have a number of servers with a number of logical instances? How do I use my realms? What markets are accessing it? What apps are being constructed as well? So, banks typically are now building more and more apps all the time. It's not just a primary internet banking site anymore, or your primary app to log on and do your banking with. There's many. So, point of presence. The view then would be, okay, let's think about how we instance from a geographic point of view. So we might do instances in, say, North America versus, say, AP, because obviously you're not going to have everyone going across the globe to do access management, just from a proximity perspective. Within HSBC, then there's geopolitical boundaries. So even in the US and Mexico, there are certain requirements around the way with which Your access management can work and interop, but some ways they cannot. So key sharing doesn't work across borders in that location. So can you use one instance? Not necessarily. So between markets, we can then split on an instance, for instance. With a market, you've got multiple apps. The question is, does that app A work with the same instance as app B? And in terms of the journey, how do you do customer experience, or how do you actually provide the security to your apps? You go into we're looking at an A/B kind of world. So the idea is that there's no one way that we do it. We actually want to do a sort of almost an A/B way of rolling out our security. And so this is the way that we sort of split the world up, or split the access to our access management layers in a way that we can start to control. The view being, of course, that when we grow and get better at a certain journey, or we think we do something a little better, we can actually start to put customers into, say, a B journey versus an A. And around this area, we're sort of talking more about logical realms, logical instancing of the OpenAM set. And within a logical instance, you can then slice up into realms. So we're using the technology in the best way possible to ensure that we get the best use of our underlying hardware to create the instancing that we need to meet regulatory requirements. But then also to enable a developer capability, or at least the way that we grow as a bank, to be able to grow our journeys independently. The view being, we don't want to just keep rolling stuff out all the time. We don't want to have to keep changing everything every time we have a bit of a steer in a different direction. So in terms of biometry, the bank is definitely, as I said before, has a very strong appetite to get into that space. And my personal view around biometrics is that it's definitely has adapted and evolved to a point where it's actually very usable. So capability-wise, it's growing. And for that reason, it's not reached a destination yet. To my mind, I think it's also going to evolve even more, and it will change. So from that perspective, biometry is really something that we want to invest in a way that we can pivot easily. So the idea is that ForgeRock is a foundation around a middleware about identity and flow, and policy, access to certain realms, splitting against apps. But because ForgeRock isn't in the biometric space, the view is how do we actually enable biometric authenticators into the auth chains that exist as a standard feature of the ForgeRock tech. We have to assume that things will change rapidly. So the ability to bring in an authenticator or a certain type of biometric capability, or eject it and jettison that capability if it becomes, say, defeated or not useful within a market, that's the normal steady state. So we build to pivot. It's actually normal for our stack to have a particular type of credential as just a thing that gets instanced and run within a certain posture or a position or certain market. So there's no sort of static security or implementation against a specific biometric provider. It is abstracted by the ForgeRock middleware. And so when that then hooks into your underlying systems underneath, we're trying to create this huge binding between what a biometric provider would do, the middleware that enables it, and the places that we store it to actually get a holistic view around what's happening with authentication. So in a sense, we're more or less using biometric providers has to come through ForgeRock. The idea is certain biometric providers as well generally have their own stores, they work their own way. We want to adapt it into the ForgeRock set so we get the whole holistic nature. For those that know me, I'm a huge proponent of APIs. I think banking APIs are awesome. I think they're very cool. Even though that, to my mind, I don't see a huge amount of API work against banks, but some are doing it, and I think there's a very bright future for it. So programmatic access to the bank, I think, it's inevitable. So actually, when I went over and I started building on this new ForgeRock set, and I realised all of the features it had, part of what I wanted to do, of course, was to create a whole sort of big OAuth 2 open banking sort of methodology. And I didn't know it at the time, but there was this thing called the Competition Market Authority, which is effectively UK saying you're going to do it. Within the UK market, we actually have to have open banking. And there was actually some discussions on the panel earlier about what is the efficacy, I think, of offboarding and onboarding between banks. personally, I'm not really that worried because I get to do my API stuff. I think there's going to be a lot of extra goodness out of that, irrespective of the outcomes of the CMA initiative. So by Q1 2018, we actually have to have full authenticated journeys set up in the UK with very, very stiff fines if we're not there. HSBC is on track and we'll have that. And I think it's really about how to actually create a set of capabilities to enable a relying party to hook into the bank. I don't know all of the use cases that could be in play. I think there's an enormous amount of business function that can be derived from APIs. And it's really not necessarily my job to know all of that. I think my job is to ensure that the capability is there. So actually the OIDC and the OAuth capabilities are there, ready and primed for use. And I'm more or less saying, here's the capability, use it, and grow the new business function that can come out of it. I think in terms of the external parties that exist within a bank, it'll be a softly approach. There will be fairly low security bar APIs being written and driven, but the capability is there to grow it, and I think that's the important part. It was easy to do, actually. I mean, this is what ForgeRock Access Management does. It's fairly typical. If you've written Facebook apps before or anything along the lines of Twitter streams, etc., this sort of stuff is fairly normal, and it just feels right to me that a bank would go there as well. From an identity management point of view, there's an enormous amount of potential for the HSBC to do a better job at understanding our customers. We do definitely have a global client footprint. In fact, I would describe the global markets as really one of HSBC's unique selling points. People have HSBC accounts when they have footprints in different markets. Now, I myself have got an Australian HSBC account, and I also have a UK HSBC account, but I am, unfortunately, two people. I've even locked my Australian account, and I don't know how to unlock it. So I'm using my UK stuff, and I'm not really able to get into my Australian bank. And that's really just me because I've got to talk to two different, fundamentally two different banks. So they don't actually know that I'm the same person at all. And it's fairly common as well when you have some executives come in and talk about what they need. They'll lift up their key fob and there'll be like 4 OTP devices hanging off it saying, please, can I just have one? And in fact, we want to do away with the whole ForgeRock, the key fob thing completely and use ForgeRock tech to do a single global identity and use the new stuff anyway. So yeah, we're listening, and it's really about how do you siphon up all of that information, and this is where open IDMs sort of come into play. A digital bank around who you are, the siphoning of data from various repositories and silos that exist all over the world. Now, in terms of the legalities of that, well, we have one platform then to solve that problem. The view would be that we bring that all together and we actually have a holistic view of customer data. The question then is, how can you also surface that information into an access management layer as well? And so we want to participate in an identity as a service function. We want to be an identity data market. And there are other initiatives going on as well within the UK, the gov.verify and other aspects where we want to be a participant in that to do highly secure authentication, consent-based release of data, and to be a participant in that whole ecosystem. There's a lot to actually get from that. I mean, the data is very rich. We just have to unlock it. And I think the capability to do so is very easy. It's there. We just got to bring it all together and turn it on. This point is actually does the rounds on LinkedIn quite a lot, and it's an actual quote which it resonates with me quite well. I actually don't think that I service HSBC customers in my job. I don't think that what I do is in fact a customer experience outcome. Everything I do, I believe, is to create permission for developers to build stuff. And I think in terms of innovation, and certainly within banking, you can't really innovate and keep secure exactly at the same time because it keeps you in lockstep. So part of what I think you get from ForgeRock, part of what has been where I think you spend your time coding, is not, again, on the actual product. Don't build another ForgeRock. Don't build another OpenAM. Turn on the features of the ForgeRock product set in a way that works. And so when I go onto AWS and I muck around and I sort of build a new app and I do some Lambda and stuff, I just click buttons and it's like this palette of stuff, hey, have it. And that's what I think is missing in big organizations. I cannot build stuff because I have to immediately go and ask, how do I secure this? Or is this in policy? Is this within the guardrails of what I need to do? And unless the security system is enabled for you to do that easily, then I think you're going to lose. You're actually losing that innovation capability. You're not enabling your developers. So I think that's where the guardrails and the patterns come in. And I'm sure certainly within enterprise architecture and all of that and security architecture, there's guardrails, you should do it this way, and here's our pattern, you should totally use that. And then you go and try and do it, and you've got what? What piece of technology is in fact off the shelf, ready to roll to use. So I think the point being is that as a technology provider, and for people in the room here, I think it's our job to make it available to our developers. And once that's available to our developers, the developers do the cool stuff to actually deliver it to our customers. And that very much underpins the business and the view of what I think HSBC is seeking to do. Thank you very much for your time. It's been an honour and a privilege to speak today. Thank you very much.
Actually, so we've got a couple of minutes. Does anyone have any, after we've flown Ian all the way out here, do we have any questions for Ian? I mean, just amazing stuff. I love the story and the synchronicity between what Ian's been telling us and what we heard from Forrester and Mike this morning as well. So while we have Ian here as a public face of someone that's actually working very closely with ForgeRock, any questions for him at all?
We've got to go out the front.
Given that you have so many prod environments, how do you manage the change across all the environments? And if there's any downtime applicable for those?
This is absolutely where the instancing model comes in. So the current HSBC capability is security built into the entire stack. So what happens is you drop the technology in and then everything's linked to it. So the new method with ForgeRock is to actually provide as much granularity as you can. So within any particular, unless we're upgrading the version of ForgeRock, which is, say from 5 to 5.1 or whatever that may be, that's a fairly significant one. You're changing the policy. It's all about dynamic policy and about what you're locking onto. So we might do a change, but the change is actually to different endpoints. And certainly where you've got multiple instances running, you're actually about shifting traffic from one system to another. It's actually a significant problem because of the different markets that live and might actually point to one POP. It's all about instancing as many times as is possible, but also having a very strong logical separation capability around that as well.
Hi. Can you elaborate a little bit more on some of the ways that you've used ForgeRock to enable your developers, like getting that balance between safety and I guess, rapid development going?
So I think a lot of it's around ensuring that we broker our authentication flows as best we can. So there's an API capability around ForgeRock, so you can sort of say, hey, knock yourself out and do a whole bunch of stuff. What the actual method is to actually, we're creating what is like a global experience library of authentication primitives, and then a series of policies that actually link a lot of those different primitives together, and then enabling an individual market to sort of take examples of how things work and actually create their own policy chains themselves. And I think this is fairly important. It's about policy chains, actually. Once you create the authenticators and you've got policies, you're talking about a dynamism. It's actually dynamic to how an actual market can use it. So when they say, look, I need to lock out after 5, not 3, and I want to do this authenticator next, the view would be, well, you're actually just constructing a configuration for that market and instancing a realm effectively for them. So it's high use of realms and logical connection flows for that. Otherwise, yeah, you're stuck in this whole process of build and build and build, and you just can't work rapidly enough. So it's about configuration, actually.
I was going to ask you a hard one, but I'll give you an easy one.
That's all right.
Are you using any of the adaptive security features of ForgeRock?
We're primed, actually. We're primed for the adaptive features. So at the moment, we're trying to get the technology bedded into the bank across the globe, which is really hard. And there's a lot of work to do there. The view then, of course, is that that's primed for adaptive flow. So customers will soon see an actual dynamic change in terms of the way that you authenticate. So whilst we're not turning those features on now, we're absolutely ready. The next part of it, or the next big piece, is an actual AI-based engine around continuous authentication. So the moment you can start to get context and you get a continuous authentication capability going on, you're only just driving the dynamic capability you've already got. So I'm not rebuilding it, but I'm attaching a new driver to that. So adaptive authentication, risk-based authentication, it's all just sitting there waiting to unwrap. And I think that's the beauty. When you go to ForgeRock, you might think you can build stuff, but actually when you think about all the stuff that can come from it, you're going to miss out on a lot of good capabilities there. So those policy flows, again, like I was talking before, they actually just get programmatically changed and switched premised on inputs. And that's where the adaptive piece comes in. We've got one over there as well.
Thanks, Ian. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on FIDO versus proprietary biometric solutions.
The use of FIDO at the moment is the view to take on FIDO is a little nascent in HSBC, and I think majorly because I have different regulatory constraints from different markets as to what's viable. So at the moment, the FIDO capability is open to be used, but isn't actually sitting in our first round of biometric capabilities. Some of them, depending upon where we drop, require server-based authentication. Some of them actually do biometrics that go via HSBC and then back into a government repository. And those kind of use cases don't really lend well to a FIDO-based authenticator, which is sort of typically a shared trust level between a device and yourself and the bank. So FIDO is there, and I think it's going to play better into when we start growing our open API world. But at the moment, we're trying to hit the biggest bang around our other markets, which have much stronger requirements around how do you authenticate a biometric print. Similarly, too, we've also got nuanced voice ID in our call centres. We're trying to make sure we loop that back through the digital channel so that we can start using the same voice prints. And they're all server-based, so you always push your prints up to the back end and then you get an OK from the bank rather than an OK from the front. So yes, but almost, yeah. I think we're good.
I think that's it for the questions. Ian, thank you so much for being a wonderful customer.
Thank you, Aaron.
And a wonderful speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.